It's easy to be a dissident here. Look, Putin has 3 fronts. There's Ukraine, that's the real front. There's the overall front of his personal struggle with the rest of the world. He thinks he's got support from the hinterland. This war has shown that Russia has a colossal number of people who are not indifferent.
Oleg Radzinsky, Soviet dissident and later financier, writer and political immigrant, is the latest hero of On the Record for SwissInfo. Oleg, I realize everything pointed to you and I meeting in Lucerne today. That's one of the main reasons why you're here. But perhaps there are some other reasons why you're based in Lucerne.
What can I say about other reasons when this is, as you said, the main reason why I'm here? You know, like everything in my life, it happened by accident. I've even written a book called Random Lives about the role of chance in my life. Yeah, I've been living here for 3 years. One of the many reasons that brought me here was purely medical. I needed to have surgery and concluded that the best doctors to perform that surgery were right here in Lucerne. The famous St. Anna Clinic is here. I came here with my wife and 2 of our children, both grown up, who were travelling with us, 2 out of our 4. And we checked into the Grand National Hotel. This is where we checked in, right here. It was late at night, I remember, and in the morning I woke up early, probably at about 5:30, and I went out onto the balcony and I saw this lake. I saw these mountains, which are now unfortunately hidden by clouds. And I went straight to my wife to wake her up. She wakes up much later than I do. I woke her up and made her go out onto the balcony. From 6 until 9 we sat in complete silence, without saying a word to each other. And we looked at this beautiful scenery. At 9 o'clock, my wife Elena said to me, "Let's stay."
You said that you don't consider yourself a political opponent. But in any case, in Russia, anybody can say, "I'm a political opponent." If we look at the events of the past 2 years, many are joining the opposition. Artists, film directors, 80-year-old grandmothers. It's enough to say, we oppose the war, and we don't want Ukrainians to be killed in our name. That's enough to become a political opponent.
Well, I, for technical reasons, can't be a part of the Russian opposition, because I'm not a Russian citizen. That's the main thing. That means I don't have the right to consider myself part of the opposition. That's the first reason. Secondly, I would consider myself, even without being a Russian citizen, a member of the Russian opposition, if I lived in Russia. But since I don't live in Russia, I simply don't have the right to include myself in the Russian opposition. And I don't have the right to address Russian citizens who live in Russia and call them to do anything. I just don't feel that I have that moral right, because I'm not in the same position as they are. For example, today is the birthday of Alexei Navalny, yeah? Now, he had that right, and he earned it throughout his life by his work and his death. And he returned to Russia so that he would have this right, I think. He had it, and he did not want to lose it because he remained a Russian politician.
Is it still possible to engage in politics in Russia?
Well, you can engage in politics anywhere. There's just a certain price that you're either willing or not willing to pay in order to do so. That's it. If you want to be in Russia, just like in North Korea, Iran and so on, there's a certain price to pay. The most striking examples, of course, are Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Putin, Ilya Yashin. We see that there are people who are willing to pay this price.
You don't see this as being in any way not offensive, I wouldn't put it that way, but kind of naive. Is it naive to think that if Putin goes away tomorrow, then all of a sudden we will get this beautiful Russia of the future that everyone's been dreaming of?
Well, it's naive to assume a lot of things. I'll tell you this. In 1982, when I was arrested under Article 70, Part 1 for anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, this is a particularly dangerous criminal charge, a particularly dangerous crime against the state. There was a section in the Soviet Code from Articles 64 to 73. This was the so-called special section of the criminal code. These were particularly dangerous crimes against the state. Article 70 was one of them. Okay, so there I was, sitting in Lefortovo prison. I had no idea that in 9 years' time there would be no Soviet Union. And by 1991 it was already gone. So we don't know what the day ahead will hold for us, what windows of opportunity will open, and who will open those windows. So it's hard for me to say anything about their enthusiasm, their naivety. Maybe it's naive, maybe it's not naive. But I even wrote an essay about this in the magazine True Russia. The essay was called Non-Belonging, and I was just saying that the best thing, of course, is to live as though the situation will not change, but at the same time, prepare for the possibility of returning to Russia. Because if you live in the past all the time, or obsess over the past, then schizophrenia sets in.
I wanted to ask you about the book. Yes, in Random Lives, you said at one point the real warriors are human rights activists, like Alexander Podobinek, Vladimir Bukovsky, because they fought for your freedom and for ours. And you wrote that I was fighting for my heroic image. And yet, you served time. You were exiled for 5 years. So that's not entirely true. You were probably fighting for something else. And what are you fighting for now?
Yes, but first of all, it has to be said that this is the only non-fiction book I've written. It's a biographical book that reflects a certain period in my life, the lead up to my departure from the Soviet Union. Yes, well, look, I was very young. And certainly, a big part of my human rights work has been, I have to admit, dictated by the poisoning influence of Russian literature. Because Russian literature is very messianic. It isn't just something that, people write, read, forget about, or don't forget about. It's literature at a biblical level. It requires all of your time. It requires you to take a stance. Russian literature demands that you take action. It doesn't leave you with the possibility of inaction if you don't look at it simply as black symbols printed on white paper. Along with Russian culture in general, by the way, it has an inherently eschatological character. Everything is seen as a struggle between good and evil. And this struggle, good versus evil, this is the ultimate battle. Everything it's not just a struggle for some economic or political principles. No. It's always a struggle between good and evil. It's always saying, this is good and this is evil. And here's what side you're on. That's kind of how it is. And that's the way I was raised. I grew up in a family of intellectuals. Back then, there was this cliché, family of artistic intelligentsia. I grew up in a family of artistic intelligentsia, and I had this very strong urge to be on the side of good, that I'm doing something that puts me on the side of good, that I'm doing something that puts me on the side of good, and I'm on the side of good. There's Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I'm not far away.
Well,
And I was very happy when I was sent to Lefortovo prison. I remember I was so excited that here it is. This is the confirmation that I was doing everything right. I'm right here with them. Yes, I remember. It was a moment where my vanity was rewarded.
Do you feel like a dissident now, like you did back then? An important dissident?
No, of course not. Important dissidents are sitting in Russian prisons. That's where they are. and you and I are in Switzerland. It's easy to be a dissident here.
Oleg, you said that you don't consider yourself an important dissident because dissidents are sitting in Russian prisons right now. But nevertheless, you've written and suggested a method for ending the Russian regime, which I want to talk to you about today in great detail.
In my essay, I've suggested specific steps that could be taken in order to exacerbate these conflicts with the center, by relying on the local population and on the region's specific issues. And then a second front would open up. Then Putin has three fronts. There's Ukraine, that's the real front. There's the overall front of his personal struggle with the rest of the world. He thinks he's got the support from the hinterland. The goal of this strategy is to deprive him of that. I don't see any other way to take it away, except by exploiting, or to use another cynical term, aggravating regional conflicts with the center. This is a dangerous strategy. I mean, I provide warnings at the beginning and at the end of the essay. It's a dangerous strategy. It can certainly lead, hopefully not to a civil war, but to certain acts of civil disobedience and a response from the authorities, including repression against activists. But this is entirely up to Russian citizens. Only they can decide if they're willing to pay such a price and risk the potential disintegration of the country to bring down the totalitarian dictatorship under which they live. And in this case, as I have said, I am an outsider. I have simply described this strategy, but I do not recommend employing it at all.
Oleg, who actually? Has anyone among your colleagues, your friends, been negative or extremely negative towards your strategy to fight Putin's regime? And what kind of arguments, counter-arguments, have they provided if they criticized you?
Yes, I was judged, stigmatized, and some might say hit in the wallet. Methods going back to the USSR. Yeah, there were such people. There were, of course, close friends, like-minded people who persuaded me not to publish this article. Their arguments were as follows. First of all, that this is a very dangerous strategy. It really could, if followed, lead to the collapse of Russia. And most of the Russian opposition doesn't want that at all. Most of the Russian opposition does not under any circumstances want Russia to collapse. That was the first argument. The second argument is this is a very dangerous strategy for those people who would be implementing it in Russia, because those in power wouldn't forgive them. I mean, they generally don't forgive anything at all, but here they realize that they really are in terrible danger.
Aren't you afraid of blood?
Of course, I would like to avoid any bloodshed, like any normal person would. I just want to... Everything I'm doing, I'm just posing the question to Russians, is this price okay or not?
I was going to say, between freedom and bloodshed, What should one choose? It's understandable you're proposing this concept, which most probably would lead to bloodshed. Is that the price of freedom?
Only the Russians can decide that. I'm not the one. I can't say anything. If they decide that it's a price they're willing to pay, right? Like the Bolsheviks decided that yes, that's a price that they were willing to pay and destroyed the Russian Empire, which later Joseph Stalin spent some time putting together again. And he did put it together, but they were willing to pay that price.
And does Switzerland have, in the structure of its political institutions, or in the way in which society interacts with political institutions, something that someday, perhaps, many, many years from now, but hopefully in our lifetimes, could be transferred to Russia, or something you would like to transfer to Russia? Again, as an outsider, if you had the opportunity.
I'd like to take basically everything from here to any country, including Russia, because it's the most, first of all, it's the only direct democracy where the most important issues are decided by referendum. Secondly, the chairman of the Federal Council, the so-called president, serves only 1 year here, as you know. So there is an absolutely mandatory rotation of power.
So people don't have time to learn who it is, right?
People don't know who the president is at all. I mean, Putin is a name that a lot of people in Russia know. They've heard it, he's been around long enough. And here, they just don't even know. And thirdly, it's as if the cantons have real independence in decision-making and in managing their budgets, which, by the way, is one of the most important things for federalism, when regions manage their own budgets. Rather than passing them on to the central power, who then distributes that same money to subsidize them. There is a general rationality and love for negotiations, rather than resolving issues by force. And, of course, the wonderful thing, neutrality. Switzerland is a neutral country. It hasn't been at war for a long time. And that's despite the fact that, look how diverse it is here. This is a country that's home to 4 main populations. The Francophones. You live in a Francophone region in Canton. Germanophones. Here, where I live, people here speak German. And then there are cantons that speak Italian, not far from here, 2 hours away. And there are also cantons that speak Romansh. Here are 4 seemingly different cultures. They're all Swiss. And their loyalty lies with Switzerland. And so if something like that can exist here, then hopefully it can exist anywhere. This can scale up. Of course, it's understandable that a country with 8.5 million people is not a country with 140 million people. But the basic principles could be taken, of course, including the main principle, the principle of a confederative structure.
The history of 20th century Russia shows us that in most cases the rulers were either in power until death, or they lost their power through coups, which can also be called
ruling until death.
Yes. So it turns out that an autocracy, like this, is the only system that has worked for governing Russia. At least until now. In Russia, where they didn't allow civil society to flourish. And if it did in some place in Russia, it still turned out to have been some kind of deformity, and then it needed to be seized or crushed. What do you think? Why, after Putin, would we get anything else than another Putin?
I think there's a large proportion of people in the Russian opposition who have realized a very important thing. In the Russian opposition, at all times, the Russian intelligentsia in general have always had great ideas. They had wonderful, wonderful civic ideas about how to rebuild society. The problem was that the majority of Russian civil society and the Russian intelligentsia wanted to write articles, make speeches, but they didn't want to become civil servants and work in ministries, because that was shameful. And democracy begins with bureaucracy. Now, if you don't have proper bureaucracy, then you will not have a proper democracy. But now the following has happened. Never before, in my opinion, at least as far as I know, has there ever been such a strong volunteer movement in Russia that deals with community initiatives. This war has shown that Russia has a huge number of people who are not indifferent, who care about the fate of not only their fellow citizens, but also the citizens of a neighboring country that has been attacked. And so, if these people were taken, trained, what's the problem with that? The problem is this. In order to implement any reforms, you have to be part of the administration. Bureaucracy is conservative and retrograde by definition, so the intelligentsia start off by sabotaging the reforms, and then they start what's called the counter-reformation. That's what we've seen. Even you, despite your youth, you've lived through it, seen it in the Russian Federation as it's happened. Because most of the people who had great ideas didn't work in the administration. And what would have been very good is if among this younger generation, those who are now called relocatees and not emigrants like before, someone could organize training, some kind of courses that would teach them bureaucratic skills. What's called institution building, institution maintenance, creating institutions and maintaining the administration of those institutions.
Maybe autocracy is just what Russia likes, and that's why the 20th century was like that. For example, remember, despite the horrors of the dictatorship, what people went through. When Stalin died, 5 million people attended his funeral. There was a crush. Hundreds of thousands of people. I don't know how it is. Why? Why it was necessary at that moment to show yourself, to express yourself in that way. I mean, maybe it's some kind of mysticism, and maybe it's just that people like being slaves.
But listen, the fact that it is that way doesn't mean that it has to be that way always. And just because that's the way Russia is now, it doesn't mean that this is the true Russia, and it can't be different. And that's why all you can do is try to make it different. To make it into something more humane, less autocratic, less corrupt, and less imperialistic. After all, Europe lived under absolutism for centuries.